morning, this is Matt here with Semper Fly, and this morning's video I'm going to talk about my several year introduction into aircraft ownership with the 1968 Cessna 172 that I owned several years ago. You'll notice that I'm not in front of Semper Fly. They're doing some land clearing at my end of the airport, so there's a backhoe right behind my hangar making a terrible racket, so I moved down here to the other end of the field, and I'm going to sit here in front of this 1950 PA-20. At least it's a Piper tail dragger in the video. In 2015, when I started looking for my 172, I used barnstormers. There's other avenues out there. A traded plane's a big one, but I really liked barnstormers. I think it's the most active web page and seems to get the most traffic. There were a lot of Cessnas for between mid-20s to mid-40s. Most of them were 63 to 68, Continental powered ones, maybe early Lycoming powered ones. They tended to be strictly VFR. They might have one digital radio and then one of the old style radios. I looked at barnstormers this morning before I made this video, and I didn't see a 172 less than about $75,000 that I thought was looking at. There were a few less than that, but they either had logbook issues, or they had damage issues, or they had significant time issues, meaning that basically the engine was run out and you were buying a chance to then do an engine overhaul on your engine. The airplane that I paid $28,000 for in 2016 probably is $50,000 now. However, it's flying. If you're worried about money, don't get into flying. Stay in boating. I have boating friends who complain about the cost of boating, and I say, yeah, buy an airplane. If you want to talk about expensive toys, buy an airplane. Cessna 172s break down into several broad versions. You have the original 1955 to 1962. These are the old 172s that don't have the wraparound rear windshield. They also are generally called the straight tails because the tails are straight in these rather than the tail with the fairing like they came along later. In 63, they went to the OmniVision, which is the wraparound rear windshield, which changes the look into the modern one. They stayed Continental powered until 68. 68, they went to Lycoming powered. And that version of the 172 stayed that way till 1981, when basically they stopped producing them. Those are going to be Lycoming 320 and Lycoming 360 powered. There's different versions of the Lycoming, and I won't go into that in this video. You can Google that and see all the different versions of the Lycoming that they had in the 172. They changed the instrument panel over the years and became the more modern traditional six-pack style instrument panel. They also changed the landing gear, and there were some other small changes over the years. Then in 96, they came back with the R model, which was the first modern 172. Looked the same as a 172, had nicer seats, had a nicer panel, bigger airplane, heavier airplane, could carry more gas. Right when I was getting out of my first batch of flying in the late 90s, the FBO I had several R models and several S models, and they are very nice. They're a little bit faster, certainly nice interiors, very nice panels. One of them had an autopilot. They had an early version of the Garmin GPSs, which was nice. One thing I'll mention about those versions of 172s, they're probably crazy expensive now, and they're fuel injected. Nothing wrong with fuel injected, but the fuel injected Lycomings in those 90s versions of 172s were a pain to start when they got hot. The owner's manual actually had a little page for how you start a hot fuel injected Lycoming 360. And if you go back and read it, it actually requires three hands because it tells you to operate the key, mag switch with one hand, operate the throttle with the hand, and then manipulate the mixture at the same time as the throttle. If you count that up, you need three hands. Now, there was a way with practice to use your right hand and move both the throttle and the mixture at the same time to get it started. And after you did it a few times, you kind of got the hang of it. But when I first started flying those, you'd fly it for 2 hours, you'd stop and get gas, and it would take you 20 minutes to get it started again because the fuel-injected ones were very finicky to start. I don't know if the more modern ones are better at that. Now, I've never flown one of the glass panel 172s. If you're getting instruction now, you're probably doing it in a glass panel. All of my experience is in the steam gauge ones, and I'm doing this video for the people who are looking at spending $50,000 to $100,000 to buy a 172 to fly around with their family and friends on the weekend. And with that, you're probably looking at up to about a 2000s or so S model or before. So they're going to be steam gauges, and they're going to be Lycoming fuel injected. My first excursion into airplane ownership was with the 1968 Cessna 172. Couple of things that make the 1968 unique in the line of Cessnas is it's the first year that they were Lycoming powered. Mine had a Lycoming 320 in it. That was a slight horsepower increase over the Continental powered Cessnas that they'd been up to that point. Mine still had the older non-standard instrument panel where, depending upon which Cessna 172 you were in, your airspeed indicator might be in a different spot than in another airplane. It's before they went to the standard instrument panel you see in the later years. Another significant difference about the 68 is it has still had the older single spring steel landing gear rather than the later tubular steel landing gear. The tube steel was somewhat more forgiving. The single plate steel that my 68 had was kind of similar to my Cub landing gear in that it had a flex to it and it would give back energy that you put into it. So if you landed a bit hard, it would flex out and then it would pull the wheels together again and it would prop you back up in the air. And I'm not proud to say that I never really got to I could land it very well. I had been renting Piper Warriors up to that point for several years prior to that, and I'll probably do a video later about why I think the Piper Cherokee Warrior series is a much better airplane than the Cessna 172. I hope that's not committing blasphemy. Yes, there's more 172s built than pretty much anything else. It's a good chance you learn to fly in a 172. But once I started flying in the Cherokees, the 180s, the Warriors, they were much better airplanes, I thought, to fly. They were certainly much better airplanes to land. But that's a video for a different time. I bought my Cessna basically Christmas of 2015. So I went through a broker up in Indiana, and I would highly recommend them. I used them both to buy that airplane and to sell and to look at some other airplanes, and I was really happy with them, and I would highly recommend them. And I'll put their link here on the page. Now the one I bought was priced right. I think I paid about $28,000 for my 172. It was very high time. It had about 11,000 hours. It had spent most of its life in a flying club in Chicago, and it got a lot of use. It also got a lot of good maintenance, so it was in pretty decent shape for an 11,000 hour 172. It had never really been damaged. It had been taken care of, and like I said, I kind of wanted a Lycoming powered 172. When I was shopping for 172s, I looked at quite a few from 63 up to 68. Now, and I looked at a bunch of Continental ones, and every Continental powered 172 I looked at had an oil leak. Now, people say Continentals leak oil. People say that they're like dogs. Continental powered 172s leak oil because they're marking their spot the way the dog does when you walk it around the block. And if I would have found the right 172 Continental powered, I would have bought it because there's certainly nothing wrong with the Continental 0300 engine, but I didn't seem to find one. I also looked at several airplanes here in Florida, and I soon realized to not ever buy a 50-year-old used airplane in Florida because they're covered in corrosion because the environment down here is just brutal on airplanes. So I ended up finding my 1968 in Chicago. I bought it from Indiana, but it had spent a lot of its time in Chicago, fairly dry climate, and it had been taken care of. The broker gave me the name of several A&P mechanics on his field that were not connected with him, although I'm sure he does send business to them. And I called several of them, and I got the idea that they were all on the up and up, and if they found a problem with the airplane, they would tell me. So I paid about $600 to have a rather extensive pre-buy done on my 168. And I got back a very detailed report from the mechanic. I think he did an excellent job on the pre-buy. There were some minor corrosion issue points on there. He went through the logbooks and made sure the airplane was legal and all the ADs were up. And basically, he said, this is a $28,000 high time 172, but there's no big hidden demons in it. So first point I'll mention is insurance. I think I paid around $1,600 a year for insurance the first year that I had it. It's a little more than what the Cub is. That is 6 years ago almost. I think I had an agreed value of around $30,000. If you're not familiar with that, unlike car insurance, with airplanes and with boats, you pick an agreed value rather than arguing over what the airplane is worth when you crash it, if you crash it, or a tornado comes and rips it up. You pay for a set value of $30,000. So if something happens and there's a total loss, you get your $30,000. So I think I had it insured for $30,000, about the same as my Cub. When I renewed the insurance, it actually went down a little bit too. I think the second year I had it, it was around $1,500, so it went down too. I don't know if they think that if you haven't wrecked it in your first year, you're less likely to wreck it in your second year. I don't know. My Cub insurance seems to have gone down the first couple of years I owned it. Not sure I understand that. You can Google and look up a video for how aircraft insurance works and maybe get an answer to that. My airplane came due for its first annual, and I took it in. The first annual ended up costing me around $5,000. There was some corrosion issues in the cockpit when they pulled the carpets up that they had to address. It needed a new cylinder. There was one instrument issue with the pitot system that had to be redone. The main most expensive issue with that was the cylinder. I had a bad cylinder, so I had to replace the cylinder. And that was about almost half of what the annual cost seemed to be. So after the $5,000 annual, my airplane was back and flying. And I flew it pretty regularly. I tried to get out there at least once a week or so and at least do bounces in the pattern or fly down to Arcadia. Like you see in this picture here, they have a nice little camping area where you can hang out in your airplane. It's about an hour south of the field where I was keeping my airplane at that time. Over the next year, my second year of ownership, I had two issues come up. First issue was my battery went dead. Batteries go dead, they die. My battery died. Luckily it died at my home field. Got it towed over to my mechanic. That was $600 for a new battery. My mechanic actually did me a decent deal because when I first took it to the mechanic, he had an apprentice there working, and the apprentice said, well, I'll get the airplane back up in the air for you. Well, he went through, he changed the battery, which he thought the battery, and then he spent about 3 hours testing the voltage regulator and everything else in the system. And he had about 3 or 4 hours of labor in checking all the other electrical system, even though once you put a battery in, the airplane worked fine. When my mechanic came back and sent me the bill, he said, no, we're not charging you for that. It was just the battery. We're charging you just for the battery. So I got back into flying. My next expense, I took off one day, and right as I broke ground and got about 50 feet in the air, I heard a loud pop and a very loud vibration and exhaust noise. Kind of a pneumatic air pulsating exhaust noise. Very, very loud. Kind of caught my attention. But the airplane was still producing power. I turned right back into a left downwind and came back and landed, taxied over, took it back to the mechanic. He opened up the cowling, and basically I'd blown a hole in one of the exhaust risers coming out of the cylinder. So he said it was a small enough hole he could just weld it and fix it rather than replacing any big parts. So he was able to weld the hole back up and fix that. And he basically said that the exhaust was not put in correctly, so he kind of had to tinker around with it for a little bit and fix that. So that ended up being about $700. My next annual was actually pretty basic because I'd had an extensive first annual. There wasn't really any big surprises in the second annual. So the second annual was around $1,000. That was basically just for the basic inspection parts that he did. So didn't really have any problem there. After that, I got back into flying my airplane. That was about the time that I came down here to the field where I'm sitting right now and got my tailwheel rating. And when I got my tailwheel rating, I found that that was the kind of flying I really enjoyed doing. So I would fly my Cessna, but maybe once a month I'd come down here and rent an Aeronca Champ, go fly around in the Aeronca Champ for a while. And pretty soon it came to the point to where I wanted to go flying that day, but I realized that deep down I'd rather go down here and rent the Aeronca Champ than go in my Cessna 172. Almost all of my flights, I looked at my logbook this morning, almost all of my flights in my 172 I was by myself. There were maybe 4 or 5 flights where I took a passenger for a ride. And if I was taking a passenger for a ride, it'd be a lot more fun to take them for a ride in my Cub or the Aeronca than in the 172. So I realized going into the end of my second, beginning third year of ownership, I began to realize that the 172 was too much airplane for me. It had 4 seats, you could load it up with baggage and people and you could go fly 500 miles, but that wasn't the kind of flying I was doing. What I was doing was going on little half-hour hops to surrounding airfields and getting lunch or getting breakfast and flying back or practicing landings or coming down here to the grass strip where I am now and doing landings. I realized that I had bought too much airplane. I bought more airplane than I needed. There's a fair amount of 172s down here, and I can tell you that probably 98% of the time I see them, they have 1 or 2 people in them. So it's common, there's a saying that if you want to take 2 people flying, you buy an airplane with 4 seats. And if you want to take 4 people flying, you buy an airplane with 6 seats. And there's probably some truth to that. But at the end of the day, I bought too much airplane. Now, I called the broker up in Indiana where I'd bought the airplane from. I asked him if he was interested in buying it back, and he said he probably could sell it. So he put it back on his page, and then within about a week, another flight school bought my airplane, and they flew it off, and now it's back in a training fleet. So that airplane is probably up to 14,000 hours now, with as busy as most flight schools are. So there you have it. Over about 3 years, I spent about $1,500 a year on average on insurance, and I spent about $6,000 or $7,000 in maintenance cost. Had I kept the airplane, I think the maintenance cost would have gone down because I was addressing issues in the airplane that had not been addressed, and the annuals, hopefully years going forward, would have been a little better. The engine was pretty much mid-time. It had about 800 hours, so I think I had a lot of time left in the engine. But for me, I bought too much airplane. I bought more airplane than I really wanted to fly. The type of flying I was interested in doing was just not what the 172 was going to be good at. The Piper Cub was going to be much better at the kind of things I wanted to do. So after several years and learning about what it's like owning an airplane, that was when I sold the 172 and started looking for a tail dragger, which is where I am now. That's just my experience. If you're interested in a 172, I looked at Barnstormers again this morning, and they're getting expensive, but if you want something you can put 1 or 2 people in and fill up with gas and go fly 500 miles to go away for the weekend or go on a golf outing, they're great airplanes. They're not terribly fast, but they're easy to maintain. Every mechanic in the world in this country can work on a 172. So there is that. That was my experience. I hope that helps you if you're looking at what it's like to own a 172. The new ones are about $450,000. If you're looking at buying one of those, I can't help you. But they build a lot of them. There's a lot of them out there. You have to look at a lot of frogs till you find your prince. I looked at a bunch of airplanes until I found the one that I bought, and the one that I bought was pretty much, there weren't any hidden dangers in it. I mean, it lost a cylinder, but you can lose a cylinder at any time you're flying. So I was happy with owning mine. It was a good experience, but it led me to believe the kind of flying that I felt like doing, and that's what I'm doing now. So thanks for watching. If you enjoy these videos about small general aviation airplane ownership, hit subscribe, and I'll try and keep providing information for people out there like me that were sitting around one day and say, hey, I want to fly more than I'm flying and I'm tired of renting, so what can I do? So if you enjoy the video, hit subscribe. Thanks a lot, and keep flying. Something. Cherokee, Warrior, Cub, something, but keep flying.